The ever-resilient Ruby Amethyst deck has once again shown itself to be a force in the Ursula's Return metagame, and in this video we're going to explore a couple of reasons why this might be a good option for you to choose as we move forward in Set 4's meta. The first reason is, well, if you've had this core, or even if you're building this deck from the ground up, it's not very expensive. The upgrades required from Ursula's Return are not very expensive at all, and overall this deck comes in at around 150 or less USD if you are building it from the ground up. The second is that this deck got a lot more resilient in terms of its aggro matchups, mainly against Emerald decks where it would struggle before, because of things like the new Flynn Rider Frenemy, being able to keep pace with the lore gain instead of having to worry about outing the opponent's board with things like Pinocchio and Rafikis. The final thing I'll say is, overall, this deck is just very well rounded. It's a tempo-oriented mid-range control deck that is able to have good matchups into most of the metagame and not really struggling too much with anything overall, and a good player who really understands their matchups and interactions can definitely edge out a lot of wins with this deck. So with that being said, before I start commentating over this particular matchup, which is definitely one of the key matchups for the meta in Ruby Sapphire versus Ruby Amethyst, because Ruby Sapphire is definitely one of the, if not the deck to beat in the metagame right now, I will say that the deck profile for my Ruby Amethyst deck is linked in the description, where I explain each card choice and kind of break down the interactions and the advantages of each one. So there are a lot of key points that we're going to need to cover in this matchup, so hopefully I can get to them all and you can kind of see how they play out. On the draw, obviously we're at a disadvantage here, so turn 1 is the Chernobog Followers, and turn 2, because we didn't have a 2-drop, is going to be the Minnie Mouse Always Classy, another 1-drop. This is one of the benefits that I talk about in my deck profile about Chernobog's Followers, is that once the card doesn't really represent good value in terms of its board presence, you can just banish it once you quest in order to draw a card. And the Minnie Mouse is the same thing. Usually these are underwhelming cards on board. Once they've quested for a couple of lore, you don't really want them to stick around because they just get outed very easily by the opposing character and therefore generate you negative card advantage. So being able to quest with that Minnie, bounce it back to hand, and use it as ink next turn with the Mim Fox represents decent value. Now the opponent on 4 ink is going to drop the Great Stone Dragon, and this is a card that is definitely a huge problem for Ruby Amethyst. You saw the opponent ink with their Fishbone Quill earlier, and that's not great for us. We would much rather than play that Fishbone Quill, and most Ruby Sapphires won't be on the Stone Dragon, but if they are, this is a card that really would give you a tough time in this matchup for two main reasons. One is that they're not going to be using Fishbone Quill if they're using the Stone Dragon, as you saw this opponent ink their Fishbone Quill, and two, they don't need to ink from their hand every turn, and they don't need to aggressively ink with Fishbone Quill from their hand, further reducing their card advantage because they're able to passively ramp with the Great Stone Dragon. Yes, this card is slower, but in these slower control-oriented matchups, they can definitely afford to play the grind game with the Stone Dragon. So if you do run up against this is actually one of your worst potential matchups, but if they're on the Fishbone Quill version without any Stone Dragon ramp, you actually have an advantage because the opponent is going to lose a lot of card advantage trying to aggressively ramp, and they're not going to be in a situation where they have a lot of potential options to constantly out your threats. Now, in my deck profile, I also talked about how the Queen's Castle is a key and very integral piece in winning you this particular matchup. And unfortunately for me, the opponent is able to out my Queen's Castle after it was still able to generate me 2 lore, but the Maui does represent a big threat. Basically, the reason why the Queen's Castle is so good is because as a Ruby Amethyst player, you should still be able to generate enough board presence in order to have your opponent be forced to deal with what you develop in terms of your character threats. And because of that, you're likely trading back and forth in terms of what you're playing. So you're able to out the opponent's board and your opponent is outing your board. If you're able to drop a Queen's Castle in that mix, it can be hard for the opponent to generate multiple interactions in order to out the Queen's Castle and your characters at the same time. And because of that, you're going to be able to generate a lot of passive lore because the opponent is just going to have a hard time outing the Queen's Castle unless they do something like this, where they're able to drop a decently strength character, in this case it was the Grammatala, have it survive, and then follow up with a Maui next turn. That's basically their only interaction in order to instantly out a Queen's Castle. Aside from that, there's not much else they can do unless they go wide on their board and you're unable to deal with it. But again, being a Ruby Amethyst player, you should be on a number of removal options. Here you see me drop the Madame Medusa to instantly out the Hiram. Unfortunately, it did generate them the +2 on the card draw, but we stop any additional card draw there, which is good. And here you can see the benefit of the Stone Dragon. The opponent with 7 cards in hand does not need to ink from hand. They can retain all of their threats and just have constant gas in order to deal with our board state and still gain ink from their discard pile. But we do have a King Undisputed and a Be Prepared that's ready to drop in order to help clear the board. And then we can always follow up with the Queen's Castle later. Similar to what Sapphire Steel would do post Be Prepared against Ruby Amethyst, where they would look to develop the McDuck Manor as a good option for passive lore gain. After you spent all your ink Be Preparing, they would still have that +2 lore off of the McDuck Manor. You're basically doing that same thing to the Ruby Sapphire player here potentially. Now, on 8 ink, we're going to be able to drop a rabbit and a goat, and this board state is very interesting. Now, again, unfortunately, the opponent was able to get a lot of advantage off of their Maui, singing songs if it wasn't able to challenge, and right now it looks like a really dire spot for me. But again, knowing how to play this matchup is going to be very important. This rabbit and this goat do represent a tremendous amount of advantage if I had some bounce cards like Mim Snakes or Mim Foxes in order to cycle through the advantage. The opponent, recognizing that I can kind of develop a little bit of an advantage there, opts to Be Prepared the board because they've gotten the value off of their Maui, they've gotten the value off of their Gravitalas, and putting more characters in their discard allows them to continue to ramp with the Stone Dragon. So an interesting play there, but by them clearing off their board and their Maui, I'm going to follow through with a Queen's Castle, kind of showing you here that interaction I was talking about earlier, where now that the opponent has an open board state, they're not, unless they have 2 Mauis, because they're on potentially 12 ink next turn, and Maui only costs 5, so double Maui would only be 10 ink total, they're not going to be able to out this Queen's Castle right away. Given that they have 7 cards in hand, it's a no-brainer that they just have constant removal for whatever characters I drop, and I just have to keep pace with my own forms of character removal in order to make sure that this Queen's Castle stays on board and isn't immediately outed by the opponent's characters that they're able to develop. So this King Undisputed and this Be Prepared have to go the distance in order for me to keep my Queen's Castle safe. So the opponent is going to continue to ramp and generate card advantage with characters such as the Gramatala, and you can see here why this Stone Dragon is just so much of a problem for us. We do draw Medusa, which is very important here, and basically instead of having to run out the Be Prepared and try to play around the whole Maui and Gramatala taking out my Queen's Castle like what happened on the first one I played, I'm going to drop the Medusa to take out the Lady Tremaine and then hard cast Be King Undisputed to out the Gramatala. If you weren't fearing a Maui there, you could definitely save the King Undisputed, but again, I didn't want to play into that Maui. The opponent drops a Maleficent Dragon, and they're definitely starting to feel the pressure, right? Despite all this advantage that they're able to generate and this massive hand that they're able to keep, they still are very behind on the lore. So they drop a Sisu here, in addition to the Maleficent Dragon, kind of recognizing that the Sisu probably doesn't represent too much value in this matchup. And we're just going to finally drop our Be Prepared and then follow through with our Flynn Rider. Again, not expecting that this Flynn Rider lives or anything. It's likely going to get outed, but we're in top deck mode, so there's not much we can do. The saving grace here is knowing that we're going to be able to go to 17 lore, but now the challenge is, can we close out that final 3 lore? Because we're going to have to top deck something that hopefully will allow us to keep this Queen's Castle in play for another turn. The opponent drops their big Sisu, once again ramps with the Stone Dragon, and if they don't have a Maui, we're in an okay spot. But if they have Maui, the Sisu and the Maui will be able to take out the castle. We top deck a Friends, and that's a great draw. We draw a goat and a rabbit, and I'm going to opt to drop the rabbit here, again hoping the opponent doesn't have a Maui. And drawing the Queen's Castle here is a little awkward because I don't want to ink it. I don't want to play out this goat because I am playing into a Be Prepared, and I don't want to ink the goat necessarily and play a second Queen's Castle because I still would need to out either the Sisu and or the Maui that the opponent could potentially develop that could definitely out the Queen's Castle this turn, and then my next Queen's Castle the next turn. So I could get to 19 ink, or 19 lore, sorry, but then I would need the goat to close out the game. So I just pass on this. Again, I have no doubt that the opponent has either like Be Prepareds or Mauis ready to come down, but it's just a matter of what they're going to do. And I hope you can kind of realize how insane the Stone Dragon is in this matchup for you. Like, if the opponent was on Fishbone Quill, they would not have nearly as many cards in hand, and they would not be able to constantly drop threats against us, and we would have a much easier time with this matchup in terms of closing it out. But because of that Stone Dragon, the opponent has an ink from their hand for like several turns, right? They were able to just passively gain the lore, and you can see the advantage. They're on 15 ink, they have more cards in hand, they have more board presence, but they have not been able to progress their lore state. Thankfully, the opponent didn't end up drawing into the Maui there, and because of that, we're going to be able to take this game. But that's really what this match comes down to. You really have to try to play around the Maui, keep your Queen's Castles alive, and close out the game that way. We top deck a Be Prepared here, and so instead of just playing the goat, I just dropped Be Prepared just to see what else they were on in case they wanted to try to out this Queen's Castle next turn. But knowing that they have no out to Queen's Castle here, they just end up scooping it up.